Commander Maya Brooks stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie's edge, watching the asteroid field spin slowly in the darkness of space, and she felt something was wrong, but could not explain what it was, and the mining operation had been routine for 3 weeks now, with her crew extracting valuable minerals from the ancient rocks that floated in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. Lieutenant Kate Morrison led the salvage team that day, and they were deep inside the largest asteroid when the sensors picked up something unusual, and Kate called back to the ship saying they had found a structure inside the rock, and it was not natural, and Maya told them to proceed with caution, because unknown artifacts could be dangerous. The structure was made of crystal that glowed with a soft blue light, and it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and the walls were covered in symbols that none of them recognized, and in the center of the chamber was an egg, and it was not like any egg they had ever seen before, and it was the size of a human child, and encased in what looked like frozen starlight. Kate knew she should call for more specialists, but something about the egg called to her, and she reached out and touched its surface, and it was warm and humming with energy, and she made the decision to bring it back to the ship, and her team carefully extracted the egg from its resting place and loaded it onto the transport shuttle. Maya watched as the shuttle returned to the Valkyrie's edge, and she felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed the feeling away and told herself she was being paranoid, and the egg was brought to the cargo bay, and the science team gathered around it to study this incredible find. The moment the egg was placed on the examination table, every sensor on the ship went dark, and the lights flickered and died, and emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in red light, and Maya ran to the bridge, demanding to know what was happening, and her crew had no answers, because every system had simply stopped working. Then she appeared on the bridge and no one saw her arrive, and she was just there suddenly, and she was tall and impossibly beautiful, with features that were sharp and alien, and her skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and her eyes were silver like molten metal, and they burned with an ancient fury that made everyone step back in fear. The woman spoke no language that any human knew, but somehow everyone understood her, and the word echoed in their minds like thunder, and the word was thieves. And Maya tried to speak, tried to explain that they did not know what they had taken, but the woman raised her hand, and Maya found she could not make a sound. Security officer Lisa Grant drew her weapon, but before she could fire, the woman looked at her, and Lisa froze in place, unable to move a single muscle, and the woman walked past her without a second glance, and she moved through the ship like she owned it, and no wall or door could stop her. She arrived at the cargo bay where the egg rested, and the scientists scattered in terror, and the woman approached the egg and placed her hands on its surface, and tears ran down her face, and she whispered something in a language older than human civilization. The egg responded to her touch, and the starlight around it grew brighter. Maya followed the woman to the cargo bay, and she watched as the stranger lifted the egg effortlessly and held it close to her chest like a mother holding a child, and the woman turned to look at Maya, and in that moment, Maya saw something in replating those silver eyes, and it was not just anger but grief and loss so deep it made her heart ache. The woman spoke again, and this time the words were different, and she said the egg had been damaged, and that humans had hurt something precious and irreplaceable, and Maya felt guilt wash over her because she realized they had made a terrible mistake, and this was not just an artifact or a scientific curiosity, and this was something alive and important. Before Maya could respond, the woman vanished, and she simply ceased to exist in one moment and was gone in the next, and the egg went with her, and the lights came back on, and the sensors returned to normal, and for a moment everyone stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Kate found her voice first, and she asked if everyone was all right, and Maya nodded, but she knew nothing was all right, because they had awakened something ancient and powerful, and angry, and the consequences of their actions were only beginning. Over the next few hours, reports came flooding in from human colonies across the sector, and people were seeing things in the sky and shadows moving between the stars, and something vast and alive was hunting through space, and Maya knew with a certainty that it was connected to the woman and the egg. The Galactic Council sent an emergency transmission, and Ambassador Grace Taylor appeared on the view screen, and her face was pale with fear, and she told Maya that humanity had made a catastrophic mistake, and they had awakened Kaelin. Starweaver, the last of the Aetherlin, and her dragon Vorthrax had not been seen in 3,000 years. Grace explained that the Aetherlin were beings of legend, and they had once ruled the galaxy with power beyond comprehension, and they could manipulate reality itself, and their dragons were cosmic forces that could devour stars, and they had not lost a war or been defeated, and they had simply left because they chose to, and no one knew why. Maya listened with growing dread as Grace continued, and she said that every species that had ever fought the Aetherlin had been erased from existence completely, and there were no ruins or records, just empty star systems where civilizations once thrived, and now Kalen was angry, and Vorthrax was hunting, and humanity might have just signed its own death warrant. Maya looked out at the stars, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something was coming for them, and she wondered if there was any way to fix what they had broken, or if it was already too late. And the woman's face haunted her thoughts, and especially those silver eyes full of grief and rage. The bridge crew worked frantically, trying to track the shadow that was moving through their space, but it was too large and too fast, and their instruments could barely register it. And Maya gave orders to alert Earth and to prepare the fleet, but she knew deep down that nothing they had could stop what was coming. Kate stood beside Maya, and she said she was sorry, and that she should have left the egg alone, and Maya put a hand on her shoulder, and told her they all shared the responsibility, and now they all had to face the consequences together. In the distance, beyond what human eyes could see, Vorthrax spread his wings across the void, and his scales reflected the light of distant suns, and he mourned for what had been taken, and his grief shook the fabric of space itself, and stars trembled in his wake. Ambassador Grace Taylor arrived at the Galactic Council station 3 days after the incident, and the massive structure orbited a neutral star and housed representatives from hundreds of species. And when Grace entered the main chamber, she found chaos, and delegates were shouting and arguing, and some were preparing to evacuate their people from the entire sector. The elder races were the most frightened, and these were species that had existed for millions of years and had seen empires rise and fall. And Grace watched as a Korthian elder trembled when speaking about the Aetherlin, and he said his people had legends passed down for 200,000 generations, and the legends spoke of beings who walked between stars and commanded dragons made of cosmic fire. A Vaxian diplomat shared fragmented records that had survived from the time before, and she said the Aetherlin did not conquer through war, and they simply existed, and their presence was enough to make other species kneel. And their dragons were not creatures, but extensions of their souls, and when an Aetherlin died, their dragon died with them. Grace listened to all the stories, and she realized that humanity had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding, and the Aetherlin were not just another advanced species, and they were something else entirely, and the galaxy had been at peace for 3 millennia, because they had been gone. Back on Earth, General Amy Chen mobilized every defense fleet humanity possessed, and massive warships took up positions around key colonies, and soldiers prepared for a war unlike any they had faced before. And Maya Brooks was called back to Earth to brief the military command on what she had witnessed. Maya stood in a room full of generals and admirals, and she told them about Kalen Starweaver, and how she had appeared from nowhere, and moved through their ship like a ghost, and she described the woman's silver eyes and the grief she had seen there, and she told them about the egg, and how it had been damaged. One general asked if they could negotiate, and Maya shook her head and said she did not think Kalen was interested in negotiation, and the woman had called them thieves, and she had taken back what was hers, and now something was hunting through human space, and Maya had seen the fear in the eyes of species that had existed for eons. Intelligence Officer Maya Rodriguez worked day and night, analyzing old galactic records, and she found something disturbing in the archives. And there were 7 star systems marked as forbidden zones, and no one remembered why they were forbidden, and when she investigated further, she found that these systems had once been inhabited, and now they were empty, and not just abandoned, but completely sterile, and no trace of life remained. Maya Rodriguez brought her findings to the military command, and she showed them maps of where civilizations had once thrived, and she explained that according to fragmentary records, these civilizations had all encountered the Aetherlin, and they had all done something to anger them, and within a single generation they were gone, and their worlds were left as warnings. General Chen asked what could do that, and Maya Rodriguez had no answer because the technology required to sterilize an entire star system was beyond anything humanity possessed, and even the eldest species in the galaxy could not manage such complete destruction. Meanwhile, on the colony world of New Haven, People went about their daily lives trying to ignore the warnings from Earth, and the colony governor insisted everything was fine and that the military was overreacting. And then Kaylin Starweaver walked through the main city gate at noon. She moved down the central street and soldiers raised their weapons and ordered her to stop, but she did not acknowledge them, and she walked past checkpoints as if they did not exist, and bullets passed through her without effect, and energy weapons dissipated before reaching her, and she was untouchable. Pilot Claire Bennett was in the city center when Kaylin arrived, and she watched as this impossibly beautiful woman approached the fountain in the main square, and Kaylin stopped and looked around at all the humans who were backing away in fear, and she spoke, and her voice was like music and sadness combined. Kaylin asked where the one was who had taken her child, and the crowd was silent, and no one dared to answer, and Kaylin's expression grew darker, and she said she could feel the one who had touched the egg, and she said, Kate Morrison was not here, but someone who had been on that ship was present. Claire stepped forward because she had been part of the salvage team, and she had helped load the egg onto the shuttle, and she told Kaylin that it had been a mistake, and they had not known what they were taking, and they were sorry, and they would do anything to make it right. Kaylin looked at Claire and reached out and touched her forehead with one finger, and Claire's world exploded into light and pain and memory. And suddenly she was experiencing lifetimes that were not her own. And she saw Kaylin as a young woman millennia ago. And she saw a civilization of incredible beauty and beings who sang reality into new shapes. She saw the Etherlin at their height when they numbered in the billions, and their cities floated between stars, and their dragons soared through the cosmic winds, and they were happy, and they were complete. And then she saw the plague, and it came from nowhere, and it killed the dragons first. Claire watched through Kaylin's eyes as dragon after dragon fell from the sky and their light went out, and when a dragon died, its bonded Etherlin followed within days, and whole cities went silent as grief consumed them, and Kaylin held her mate as he faded, and his dragon Silvermoon died in orbit above them. The memories continued, and Claire saw Kaylin wandering alone for centuries, and she saw her find Vorthrax, who was also alone, and his mate had died, and they bonded in their shared grief, and together they searched for a way to save their species, and after 1,000 years they found a possibility, and Vorthrax could still have children. She saw Kaylin's joy when the egg finally formed, and it took 300 years, and it was a miracle, and it was the last hope for the Aetherlin to continue. And if this egg hatched and survived, then maybe, just maybe, there could be more, and the species could return from extinction. Then Claire saw the moment when humans took the egg, and she felt Kaylin's terror and rage, and the crushing weight of losing everything again. And she understood that the egg was not just Kaylin's child, and it was the child of an entire dying species. Claire collapsed, and she was sobbing and shaking, and Kaylin stood over her and said, "Now, you understand, and now you know what your people have done." And Claire looked up with tears streaming down her face, and she whispered that she was sorry, and that humanity would help, and they would save the child. Kaylin turned away, and she said humans could not save anything, and they were too young and too reckless, and they broke everything they touched. And Claire tried to speak, but Kaylin was gone, and she had vanished again, leaving Claire on her knees in the square. The sky above New Haven darkened, and people looked up, and they saw something that made their minds struggle to comprehend, and it was Vorthrax, and he was descending from orbit, and his wings spanned continents, and his scales were made of compressed starlight. And where he passed, the air itself seemed to sing. Vorthrax did not land, and he simply hovered above the city, and his presence was overwhelming, and people fell to their knees not from force but from pure instinctive submission to something so much greater than themselves. And when he spoke, his voice was not sound but something that resonated impromptu their bones and souls. He said he was mourning, and his grief was making the stars die, and he said if his child could not be saved, then he would let his sorrow consume everything, and he would erase humanity from existence, and make the galaxy remember why the Aetherlin were feared. Maya Brooks received the transmission from New Haven, and she watched the footage of Vorthrax hanging in the sky, and she knew that humanity was facing extinction, and they had 3 days to save a dying dragon egg or face annihilation. Kate Morrison surrendered herself to the authorities and demanded to be sent to wherever Kaylin was, and she said this was her fault, and she would face the consequences, and Maya Brooks arranged for Kate to be transported to New Haven where Vorthrax still hovered in the sky, and his grief was spreading like a plague across nearby star systems. When Kate arrived at New Haven, the city was in chaos and people were evacuating as sensors detected massive energy fluctuations in nearby stars. And Maya Rodriguez had analyzed the data and determined that 3 stars within 10 light-years were beginning to destabilize, and their energy was being pulled toward Vorthrax as fuel for his mourning. Kate walked into the city square where Kaelin waited, and the Aether Lynn woman stood beside the fountain with her arms crossed and her silver eyes burned with cold fury. And Kate stopped a few meters away and said she was the one who took the egg, and she was ready to accept any punishment. Kaelin looked at Kate for a long moment, and then she raised her hand, and Kate felt herself lifted off the ground and held suspended in the air. And Kaelin said punishment was too simple a word for what humans deserved, and she said, Kate would witness the consequences of her arrogance. Vorthrax descended lower, and his massive head came into view, and his eyes were pools of cosmic fire and sadness. And he looked at Kate and I felt her mind open to his, and suddenly she was seeing what he saw, and feeling what he felt. Kate experienced the bond between Dragon and Aether Lynn, and it was deeper than love and more fundamental than life itself. And when Kaelin grieved, Vorthrax felt it as his own pain, and when Vorthrax mourned, the universe itself responded, and Kate watched as stars began to collapse under the weight of his sorrow. She saw entire solar systems where planets were torn from their orbits as stellar energy was drawn away, and she saw colonies going dark as their suns dimmed, and she saw millions of lives that would be lost if Vorthrax could not be consoled, and all of it was because she had touched an egg she should have left alone. Kaelin released Kate and let her fall to the ground, and Kate lay there gasping and weeping, and Kaelin said, now you understand the price, and now you know what humans have done. And Kate looked up and begged for a chance to make it right. Maya Brooks arrived at New Haven with a team of scientists, and she found Kate curled up on the ground, and Maya helped her up, and Kate grabbed her arm and said they had to save the egg, and millions would die if they failed. And Maya said that was why she had brought the best minds humanity had. Dr. Sophie Blake was the lead xenobiologist, and she had studied alien life forms for 30 years, and she approached Kaelin with respect and asked permission to examine the egg. And Kaelin stared at her for a long time, before nodding and leading them to a building she had claimed as her own. The egg rested on a table and it still glowed with that beautiful blue light. But the glow was flickering and unstable. And Sophie immediately saw the problem, and the crystalline matrix that encased the egg had been cracked during extraction, and the hatchling inside was slowly dying. Sophie spent hours analyzing the egg, and she used every scanner and sensor available. And finally she called Maya aside and told her the awful truth, and the hatchling needed energy to survive. And not just any energy but something pure and powerful, and the only source that would work was stellar energy channeled through a living consciousness. Maya asked what that meant, and Sophie explained that someone would have to bond with the egg and channel the energy of a star directly into it, and the process would burn them up from the inside, and they would die instantly, and there was no way around it. Kaelin heard this conversation, and she stepped forward and said this confirmed what she already knew, and the hatchling needed a soul bond to survive, and in the old days, when Aether Lynn were plentiful, a new dragon would bond with many adults and draw strength from all of them, but now there was only her, and she was already bonded to Vorthrax and could not bond with another. Maya asked if a human could bond with the egg, and Kaelin laughed bitterly and said humans were so young and so small, and they had no concept of what a soul bond meant, and it required complete sacrifice and absolute commitment, and she doubted any human possessed that capacity. Kate stepped forward and said she would do it, and she would give her life to save the hatchling. And Kaelin looked at her with something like pity and said, guilt was not enough, and the bond required true sacrifice and not martyrdom. Dr. Lauren Hayes was the quantum engineer on the team, and she had been working on calculations, and she said there might be another way, and if they could somehow distribute the energy burden across multiple people, then maybe no one would have to die. And Kaelin said that was impossible, and the bond was singular. Vorthrax spoke then, and his voice made the building shake, and he said humans were foolish, but perhaps that foolishness could be useful, and he said he would allow them to try their solution, but they had 3 cycles remaining, and if they failed he would end their species. The team worked frantically, and Maya brought in every expert she could find, and they set up equipment around the egg and tried to devise a way to channel stellar energy safely, and Sophie discovered that the egg was already trying to form bonds, and it was reaching out with tiny tendrils of consciousness looking for something to anchor to. Maya watched the scientists work, and she thought about her daughter Ellen, who was back on Earth, and she thought about all the families across human space who would die if Vorthrax unleashed his full grief, and she thought about Kaylin's face when she held the egg and the depth of loss in those silver eyes. Time was running out, and the nearby stars were growing more unstable, and reports came in of evacuations from 3 separate systems, and ships were fleeing as their home suns began to pulse with dangerous radiation, and Maya knew they were down to hours, not days. Kate approached Kaylin during a break, and she asked why the Etherlin had left the galaxy, and Kaylin was silent for a long time before answering, and she said her people had died from a plague that killed their dragons, and without 4 dragons the Etherlin faded and died with them. She explained that the bond between Etherlin and dragon was their life force, and when the plague came, it swept through the dragon population in less than a century, and billions died, and Kaylin survived only because Vorthrax had been away from the core worlds when the plague hit and he was spared. Kaylin said she and Vorthrax fled to the edges of the galaxy, and they spent 1,000 years searching for a cure, and they found none, and slowly they accepted that they were the last, and they tried to create a new egg, and it took 300 years, and when it finally formed, it was a miracle. She looked at Kate and said humans had stolen the only hope her species had, and they had damaged it through carelessness, and now even if it hatched, it might not survive, and the Etherlin might truly be extinct forever. Kate felt the weight of that knowledge, and she understood that this was bigger than human survival, and this was about preserving something ancient and precious. And she asked what would happen if the hatchling died. And Kaylin said Vorthrax would lose himself to grief completely, and he would become a force of plaintive supporter, pure destruction. Maya called everyone together and said they had to try the distributed bonding procedure, and even if it was dangerous, it was their only chance. And Sophie had calculated that if they could get 100 humans to form weak bonds with the egg simultaneously, they might be able to channel enough energy without killing anyone. Kaylin said it would not work, and the egg would reject weak bonds. And it needed someone willing to give everything. And Maya looked at her team, and she looked at Kate, and she looked at her own hands, and she wondered if she had the strength to be that person. Countdown reached its final hours, and the team had assembled everything they needed for the bonding procedure. And Dr. Sophie Blake stood before the egg running final diagnostics, while Maya Brooks coordinated with orbital platforms that would channel stellar energy from the nearby sun. Vorthrax descended from his position in the upper atmosphere, and his massive form settled on the outskirts of New Haven, and the ground trembled under his weight. And his presence made the air itself shimmer with power. And Kaylin stood beside him, and together, they watched the humans prepare. Kate Morrison volunteered again, and she said she was ready to die if it meant saving the hatchling, and Maya told her to wait, and they were still trying to make the distributed bonding work, and Kate shook her head and said she knew it would not work, and she could feel it. Sophie pulled Maya aside, and she said there was something she needed to confess, and her voice was shaking. And Maya asked what was wrong, and Sophie explained that she had been exposed to radiation 6 months ago during an experiment, and the damage was irreversible, and she had maybe 3 months left to live. Maya looked at Sophie with shock and asked why she had not said anything, and Sophie said she wanted to keep working, and she wanted to die doing something that mattered, and now she had a chance, and she could give her life to save hatchling, and at least her death would mean something. Before Maya could respond, Kaylin appeared beside them, and she said she had heard everything, and she told Sophie that a soul bond required more than a willingness to die, and it required genuine sacrifice, and Sophie's resignation was not the same as true sacrifice, and the egg would sense the difference. Sophie asked what that meant, and Kaylin explained that someone who was already dying had nothing to lose, and the bond needed someone who was giving up a full life and a future and dreams and hopes, and only that kind of sacrifice would be accepted by the hatchling. Kate stepped forward again and said she had a full life ahead of her, and she would give it up, and Kaylin looked at her with those piercing silver eyes and said Kate was still driven by guilt and not by love, and the bond would reject her too. Maya stood there listening, and she thought about everything Kaylin had said, and she thought about the memories Claire had described, and she thought about what it meant to truly sacrifice, and she realized that she understood. Maya had spent weeks working with Kaylin, and through their conversations and arguments, and moments of shared silence, she had come to see the Aetherlin, not as an alien threat, but as a mother grieving for her child and a woman, fighting to save the last remnant of her species. She had seen Kaylin's memories through Claire's descriptions, and she had felt the weight of losing an entire civilization, and she had watched Kaylin touch the egg with such tenderness and love, and Maya understood that this was not about politics or species survival, and this was about saving something precious. Maya stepped forward, and she said she would do it, and she would bond with the egg and channel the stellar energy, and Kaylin turned to look at her and asked why. And Maya said, because she understood now, and because she believed that some things transcended species. She explained that she had a daughter named Ellen waiting for her on Earth, and she had a future she wanted to live, and she was not dying and she was not driven by guilt, and she simply believed that the hatchling deserved to live and that Kaylin deserved to have her child. Kaylin studied Maya's face for a long time, and the silence stretched out, and finally she nodded and said, Maya's sacrifice would be accepted, and the egg would bond with her, and Maya felt her heart race because she knew she had just agreed to die. Sophie objected and said there had to be another way, and Kate said Maya should not have to do this, and Lauren said they could keep working on the distributed bonding, and Maya silenced them all, and said the decision was made. Vorthrax spoke, and his voice resonated through their bones, and he said humans were young and foolish, but perhaps they had more depth than he had believed, and he said he would create the chamber for the ritual, and Maya would enter alone, with Kaylin and the egg. The dragon rose into the sky, and his wings spread wide, and he gathered starlight from the surrounding space, and he wove it into a sphere that hung in orbit above New Haven, and the sphere pulsed with pure energy, and it was beautiful and terrible. Maya said goodbye to her team, and she recorded a message for her daughter Ellen, and she told Ellen that she loved her, and that she was sorry she would not be there to watch her grow up, and she explained that sometimes doing the right thing meant sacrifice. Kate grabbed Maya's arm and begged her not to do this, and Maya smiled sadly and said someone had to, and it might as well be her, and she told Kate to take care of herself and to learn from this, and Kate was crying as Maya walked away. Kaylin led Maya to a shuttle, and they flew up to the chamber Vorthrax had created, and when they entered the sphere of starlight, Maya felt the energy singing through her, and it was like standing inside the sun itself, and the egg rested on a pedestal in the center. Sophie had attached sensors to Maya, and she monitored everything from the ground, and the plan was simple, and Maya would place her hands on the egg and open herself to the bond, and Kaylin would guide the stellar energy through Maya's body and into the egg, and the process would take approximately 3 minutes, and Maya would be dead before it finished. Maya approached the egg, and she could see it more clearly now, and the crystalline shell was cracked in several places, and through the cracks, she could see movement, and something alive was inside, and it was struggling to survive. Kaylin stood beside her, and she placed her own hands on the egg, and she told Maya to be ready, and she said the pain would be intense but brief. And Maya nodded, and she thought of Ellen, and she thought of all the lives that would be saved, and she placed her hands on the warm surface. The bond formed instantly, and Maya gasped as she felt the hatchling's consciousness touch hers, and it was so young and so frightened, and it was dying, and it reached for her desperately, and Maya opened herself completely, and she let the hatchling in. Kaylin began channeling the stellar energy, and fire poured through Maya's body, and it burned like nothing she had ever felt, and her nerves screamed, and her bones turned to ash, and she was dying, and the hatchling was drinking in the wrecker's energy and growing stronger. But something unexpected happened, and as Maya's life force flowed into the egg, something else flowed back, and the hatchling was bonding not just with her, but through her, and it reached out beyond the chamber, and touched the minds of every human who was watching and waiting. People on New Haven felt it first, and then people on Earth and across every human colony, and the hatchling's consciousness spread like light, and it touched billions of minds, and it asked for help, and billions of humans responded. They sent tiny fragments of their hope and their will and their belief that life should continue. And the energy was distributed across the entire species. And it was not enough from any single person to cause harm. But together, it was a formant flood of power. Maya felt the burden lift, and the fire in her body cooled, and she was not dying anymore, and the energy was flowing through her, but it was coming from everywhere, and the hatchling was bonding with humanity itself. The egg cracked and pieces of crystalline shell fell away and something emerged, and it was small and perfect, and its scales shimmered with colors that had no names, and its eyes opened and they were full of ancient wisdom and newborn wonder. The hatchling looked at Maya, and she felt its love and gratitude, and it looked at Kaylin, and it knew its mother. And Kaylin wept, and she reached out and gathered the tiny dragon into her arms, and Vorthrax roared with joy. Maya. Brooks floated in the chamber of starlight and watched as Kaylin held the newborn dragon close, and the tiny creature made sounds like chiming bells, and it nuzzled against its mother. And Maya felt the bond still, connecting them, and through it she could sense the hatchling's joy and wonder at being alive. Vorthrax's grief vanished like smoke in the wind, and the dying stars stabilized and their energy returned to normal. And across 3 star systems people looked up at their suns and saw the dangerous pulsing stop, and they knew somehow that the crisis had passed. The chamber descended slowly back to New Haven, and when it touched the ground, the starlight dissolved, and Kate and Sophie and Lauren rushed forward to help Maya, and she was weak but alive. And the hatchling turned its head to look at all of town, them, and its eyes held ancient knowledge, despite being only 2 minutes old. Kaylin stepped out of the dissipating chamber, and she held her child with one arm, and with the other she gestured, and the air shimmered and healed, and Maya felt strength return to her limbs, and the burns and damage from channeling stellar energy faded as if they had never been. The Aetherlin woman looked at the gathered humans, and she said they had done something impossible, and they had saved her child through collective sacrifice, and she had never seen a species do that before, and she named the hatchling Lyra, after an ancient Aetherlin word that meant hope, reborn. General Amy Chen arrived from Earth, and she stood before Kaylin and asked what would happen now, and Kaylin smiled, and it was the first time any human had seen her smile, and she said that depended on humanity, and whether they could be trusted with what she was about to tell them. Kaylin called for a gathering at the Galactic Council, and representatives from every species came because they had all felt the moment when Lyra hatched, and the surge of energy that had swept across the galaxy, and they wanted to know what it meant. Ambassador Grace Taylor stood in the council chamber and watched as Kaylin entered carrying Lyra, and Vorthrax's presence could be felt, even though he remained in orbit, and his consciousness touched every mind in the room, and Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. Kaylin addressed the council, and she told them that the egg incident had been a test, and she had known immediately when humans took it, and she could have retrieved it at any time. But she chose to let events unfold because she wanted to see how humanity would respond to their mistake. She explained that every other species in the galaxy had encountered the Aetherlin at some point in their history, and every single one had either tried to cover up their mistakes or had attacked Kaylin to silence her, and none had tried to make things right. The elder races shifted uncomfortably because they knew this was true, and Kaylin continued, and she said humanity was different, and humans had acknowledged their error, and they had worked to fix it, and they had been willing to sacrifice everything to save a child that was not even their species. Vorthrax spoke through Kaylin, and his voice filled the chamber, and he said he had judged humanity and found them worthy, and he declared that the Aetherlin would share knowledge with humans that had been kept secret for 3,000 years. The council erupted in protest, and species that had existed for millions of years objected to humans receiving such favor, and Kaylin silenced them with a gesture, and she said the decision was made, and those who disagreed were welcome to challenge her, and no one accepted that invitation. Maya was named as Lyra's guardian, and Kaylin explained that the hatchling had bonded with humanity through Maya, and that bond needed to be maintained and nurtured, and Maya would live with Kaylin and learn the ways of the Aetherlin while teaching Lyra about humans. Maya accepted, even though it meant leaving Earth, and leaving Ellen, and her daughter would grow up knowing her mother was doing something important, and Maya promised to visit as often as she could, and Ellen told her she understood, and that she was proud. The first lesson Kaylin taught Maya was how to sense the fabric of reality, and the Aetherlin did not use technology the way other species did, and they manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe through will and understanding, and it took months for Maya to grasp even the basics. Lyra grew quickly, and within weeks she was the size of a large dog, and her scales shifted colors with her moods, and she was curious about everything, and she especially loved human children, and would play with them for hours, while Kaylin and Maya watched. Kate Morrison requested permission to join Maya's training and Kaylin allowed it, and Kate learned alongside Maya, and the two women formed a deep friendship, and together, they became the first humans to truly understand what the Aetherlin were and what they had lost. 6 months passed and humanity changed, and the knowledge Kaylin shared revolutionized human technology and understanding, and human ships could now travel faster, and human sensors could detect things that were previously invisible, and the galaxy watched with a mixture of awe and jealousy. But Maya noticed something troubling, and sometimes when Kaylin thought no one was watching, her expression would darken, and she would stare at the stars with fear in her eyes, and Maya finally asked what was wrong. Kaylin took Maya to a private chamber, and she showed her something that made Maya's blood run cold, and there were maps of the galaxy, and sections of it were marked in red, and Kaylin explained that these were dead zones where nothing existed anymore, and no stars and no planets and just empty void. She said the dead zones had been appearing for the last 50 years, and they were growing, and something was consuming space itself, and Kaylin had been investigating, but she had found no answers, and now the zones were getting closer to inhabited regions. Maya asked why Kaylin had not told the council, and Kaylin said she had tried 3,000 years ago, and no one believed her, and the elder races thought she was lying to maintain her power, and so she and Vorthrax had fled to investigate, alone. She explained that this was why she needed allies, and the Aetherlin could not fight what was coming by themselves, and they needed help, and humanity, despite being young, had shown they possessed something the elder races had lost. They had courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. Maya realized that the egg incident had not just been a test of humanity's character, and it had been recruitment, and Kaylin had been searching for a species that could stand beside her against whatever was creating the dead zones. Kaylin confirmed this, and she said the enemy was called the Void, born in the old legends, and they existed outside normal reality, and they consumed everything, and they had killed most of the dragons during the plague, because dragons were beings of pure energy, and the Voidborn fed on that. She said the plague had not been natural, and it had been an attack, and the Aetherlin had tried to fight, but they were too few and too scattered, and they lost, and they fled, and now the Voidborn were returning, and they were stronger. Maya asked how long they had, and Kaylin said maybe 5 years before the dead zones reached the core worlds, and maybe 10 before they consumed the entire galaxy, and Vorthrax had been trying to slow them, but he could not do it alone. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, and Maya understood now why Kaylin had chosen humanity, and she had seen something in them that reminded her of the Aetherlin before the fall. She had seen hope. Maya returned to Earth and briefed General Chen and the military command, and at first they did not believe her, but Kaylin provided evidence and sensor data, and the dead zones were real, and they were growing, and humanity had no choice but to prepare. The Galactic Council was finally told the truth, and the elder races who had dismissed Kaylin 3,000 years ago now faced the consequences of their arrogance, and species that had existed for eons realized they might not exist much longer. Kaylin stood before the council with Maya beside her, and Lyra perched on Maya's shoulder, and the young dragon had grown to the size of a wolf, and her presence radiated power and hope, and Kaylin said they had a chance, but only if they worked together. She explained that the Voidborn could be fought, but it required sacrifice and courage and unity, and the elder races looked at each other with doubt, and Kaylin said this was why she had chosen humanity, and because sometimes the only ones foolish enough to challenge the impossible were the young. Vorthrax appeared in the sky above the council station, and his wings spread across the stars, and he said the war was coming, and he said he had fought alone for 3,000 years, and now he would fight with allies. And he looked down at Maya and Lyra and humanity, and he said they would face the darkness together. Maya stood on Earth one last time before departing for the border regions where the dead zones were advancing, and she held Ellen and told her to be strong, and Ellen was 16 now, and she understood what was at stake, and she said her mother was a hero. Kaylin waited at the ship, and Lyra was beside her, and Kate was there too, along with a team of human volunteers who had trained in Aetherlin techniques, and together they would form the first line of defense against the Voidborn. As they prepared to leave, Maya looked back at Earth, and she thought about how much had changed in 1 year, and humanity had gone from stealing an egg to standing shoulder to shoulder with the most ancient and powerful beings in the galaxy. She thought about the journey ahead and the war that was coming, and she knew it would be hard and many would die, but she also knew they had something the Voidborn could not understand, and they had hope, and they had each other. Kalen placed a hand on Maya's shoulder and said it was time, and Maya nodded, and they boarded the ship, and as they left orbit, Lyra spread her wings and flew alongside them, and her scales reflected starlight, and she sang a song that echoed across the galaxy. In the distance, beyond human sensors but visible to Etherlin eyes, the first shadow moved between stars, and it was patient, and it was hungry, and it was coming, and the war for the galaxy's survival had begun, and this time the Etherlin would not face it alone.